Today, we're digging into a piece of research called Economic Exploitation Under British Rule, The Impacts on Indian Society. And really, it tackles a massive question. How did a region that was once one of the world's wealthiest become one of its poorest? So let's get right into it.
Okay, to really get what happened, you have to go back in time. Around 1750, before colonial rule really took hold, India was an absolute economic titan. I mean, think about this. It accounted for more than 20% of the entire world's economy. And we're not just talking about farming. It was a global leader in manufacturing, especially when it came to things like high-quality textiles. Now, let's fast forward about 200 years to 1947, the year India gained its independence. Look at that number. It plummets to less than 3%. I mean, that is a staggering, almost unbelievable collapse. And this right here perfectly captures the central mystery we're exploring.
So that's the big question, isn't it? What on earth happened? Where did all that economic power, all that productivity, all that wealth, where did it actually go? The answer isn't simple, but it is, well, systematic.
And the answer starts with this incredibly powerful idea developed by early Indian thinkers. They called it the drain of wealth theory. Now, this wasn't just about a bad trade deal or a simple deficit. This was about the fundamental rewiring of an entire economy for the sole benefit of another country.
And the theory is very precise. It defines this drain as a systematic, one-way transfer of wealth. You have money, resources, and goods flowing from India to Britain. But here's the crucial part. Absolutely nothing of equivalent economic value ever came back. It was a one-way street.
So who was the person who first really figured this all out? It was an Indian intellectual named Dadabhai Naoroji. He was the one who put a name to it, and more importantly, he was the one who crunched the numbers to prove that this drain was real, it was deliberate, and it was absolutely devastating.
And Naoroji's work showed the sheer scale of what was happening. We're talking millions upon millions of pounds being siphoned out of India every single year. You know, this wasn't just lost profit. This was capital that could have been reinvested back into India's own industries, its own development. Instead, it was used to help fuel Britain's Industrial Revolution.
So, how did they pull off such a massive transfer of wealth? Well, it wasn't just a single policy. It was more like a strategy, a kind of three-step colonial playbook.
And the process was brutally simple and efficient. First, you exploit the primary source of wealth, the land. Second, you crush any local industries that might compete. And third, you set up the whole system to make sure all the profits from steps 1 and 2 are funneled directly back to Britain.
So let's start with step 1. Exploit the land. The British brought in completely new systems for collecting taxes on land. And here's the key change. Taxes were now fixed, and they had to be paid in cash. It didn't matter if you had a great harvest or a terrible one. This put a huge amount of pressure on farmers, and so many of them fell into crippling debt just trying to pay what they owed. And, this wasn't a one-size-fits-all thing. They had different systems in different parts of India, the permanent settlement in Bengal, the Rayat Wari system in Madras, but the end result was always the same. It led to more debt, less food security, and a big shift towards growing cash crops to be exported, not food for the local people.
Okay, on to step 2, crushing local industry. Remember how India was a manufacturing powerhouse, especially with textiles? Well, Britain brought in policies that were designed to favor its own goods. They flooded the Indian market with cheap machine-made textiles from places like Manchester. And at the same time, they slapped heavy tariffs on Indian exports, making them uncompetitive.
And this right here is the whole story in a nutshell. Look at this transformation. India goes from being a global exporter of valuable finished goods to being basically a supplier of cheap raw materials, like cotton. That cotton would then get shipped to Britain, get turned into cloth in a factory, and then sold right back to the Indian market. And that brings us to the final, crucial step, funneling all the profits. The money from those heavy land taxes, the profits from that unequal trade, all of it was channeled directly back to Britain. It paid for the colonial administration, it funded British wars, and it enriched the empire. It was a perfectly self-sustaining cycle of exploitation.
Now, it's so important to remember that this isn't just an abstract economic theory. This system had a real, devastating, and frankly tragic human cost that was felt for generations.
The results were just catastrophic.
You saw entire industries that had been around for centuries just wiped out, pushing millions of skilled artisans into poverty. You had farmers trapped in cycles of debt they could never escape, and most tragically of all, you had continuous, widespread, and deadly famines.
And this is a really critical point. The great famines that happened during the colonial era, these were not simply natural disasters. They were what modern scholars, looking back at this period, have termed man-made disasters. Yeah, the Nobel-winning economist Amartya Sen famously described these not as failures of food availability, but as entitlement failures. What that means is often there was actually enough food in a region to feed everyone, but because of colonial policies, like continuing to export grain for profit even during a drought, people simply couldn't afford to buy it. Their basic entitlement to food had been completely erased by the system.
And as the source paper for this explainer shows, this isn't just ancient history. Scholars today are still uncovering and analyzing the deep and lasting social and economic wounds that were left behind by these policies.
Because, of course, the story doesn't just end in 1947. The legacy of this economic drain is deeply woven into the very fabric of modern South Asia.
Think about it. The infrastructure that was built, things like the famous railway system, it was primarily designed to get resources out of the country efficiently, not to connect communities or build a healthy, balanced internal economy. This created deep regional imbalances and inequalities that post-colonial nations are still struggling with to this day.
But there was another, maybe unintended, side effect to all of this. The very system of economic exploitation actually helped unify people against a common problem. These economic grievances became a powerful rallying cry for nationalist movements, fueling the demand for independence and the right to self-rule.
And that really leaves us with a final massive question to think about. Understanding this history isn't just about looking at the past. It's about asking ourselves, how do the economic frameworks that were built for exploitation centuries ago continue to shape the challenges and the opportunities of the world we all live in today?